The Type 95 Hago light tank emerged from the sugarcane tree line at 1347 hours, 800 yards southeast of Corporal James Mitchell's position on the volcanic ridge. The tank's 37mm main gun could fire 14 rounds per minute with an effective range of 1,200 yards, and its frontal armor was thick enough to shrug off small arms fire. Mitchell's fire team possessed 3 M1 Garand rifles, 2 Browning automatic rifles, and 17 fragmentation grenades effective at 30 yards maximum. The tactical manual was explicit. Infantry did not engage armor without bazooka support or air cover. Both were unavailable. The radio operator lay dead 20 yards behind Mitchell, his SCR-300 backpack radio destroyed by the same mortar round that had killed him. The next American tank platoon operated 6 miles north, pushing through Garapan. Between Mitchell and those tanks stood 2,000 Japanese infantry, 3 artillery batteries and terrain that made rapid armor movement impossible. The Hago moved slowly down the dirt track between the sugarcane fields, its turret traversing left in a methodical search pattern. The commander apparently believed the ridge was undefended, a reasonable assumption given that Mitchell's platoon had been bypassed during the initial Marine advance 3 days earlier. The 38 Marines on the ridge were supposed to be a blocking force, preventing Japanese infiltration from the south. Instead, they'd been cut off when Japanese forces counterattacked and severed the supply line. Now they held a position that division had probably written off as lost, with no communication, no resupply, and no expectation of relief. Mitchell studied the tank through his field glasses. The Hago was a light tank by American standards, barely 11 tons fully loaded. But it was still a tank. Its armor would stop rifle rounds and grenade fragments. Its 37mm gun could reduce the Marine positions on the ridge to rubble within minutes. The tactical situation was clear. If the tank identified their location and called artillery support, the Marines would be dead within the hour. If the tank advanced up the ridge, they'd be overrun. The only question was whether Mitchell had time to do anything about it before one of those outcomes occurred. The sugarcane stood 7 feet tall, dense enough to provide concealment but not cover. A drainage ditch ran perpendicular to the tank's approach vector, angling from the tree line toward the base of the ridge. Mitchell could see the ditch clearly from his elevated position. It was approximately 4 feet deep, sides thick with vegetation, running within 50 yards of where the tank would pass if it continued on its current heading. The ditch offered a concealed approach route, but only if Mitchell could reach it before the tank's commander spotted movement on the ridge. Private First Class Rodriguez crouched beside Mitchell, his BAR resting across his knees. "Corporal, that thing spots us, we're dead." "I know. So what's the plan?" Mitchell continued watching the tank. The Hago's weakness was its side armor, thinner than the frontal plate, vulnerable to concentrated fire at close range. The tank's commander was exposing his side as he traversed left, searching for targets. If Mitchell could get close enough with the grenades, he might be able to damage the treads or engine compartment, disable the tank, and the immediate threat disappeared. Fail, and he'd die trying while the rest of the fire team died when the tank called artillery on their position. The math was simple. 17 grenades effective at 30 yards. The tank would pass within 50 yards of the drainage ditch if it maintained its current course. Mitchell would need to close the final 20 yards in open ground, throw the grenades before the tank's crew spotted him, and hope that 17 fragmentary grenades could damage a light tank's mechanical systems enough to immobilize it. The odds were poor, but the alternative was certain death for 38 Marines, and that wasn't acceptable. "Rodriguez, when I move, you and Williams keep that turret crew busy. Don't waste ammunition on the armor. Aim for the vision ports and the commander's cupola. Make them button up and blind themselves." "Corporal, you're not seriously." "That's exactly what I'm doing. Pass the word to everyone. When you hear grenade explosions, hit that tank with everything we've got. Concentrated fire on the side armor and rear deck. Maybe we get lucky and cook off some ammunition." Rodriguez stared at him. "This is suicide. This is the only play we have. Now move." Mitchell descended the ridge's reverse slope, staying low, using the volcanic rock for cover. He'd stripped his combat pack and kept only his rifle, pistol, combat knife, and the 17 grenades redistributed across his web gear and cargo pockets. The grenades were Mark II fragmentation types, each containing 2 ounces of TNT and a coil of notched wire designed to fragment into deadly shrapnel. Against personnel, they were devastatingly effective. Against armor, they were marginal at best. But the tank's treads were mechanical assemblies, and the engine compartment had ventilation grills. If Mitchell could get grenades into the right locations, he might achieve a mobility kill even if he couldn't destroy the tank outright. The drainage ditch was 200 yards from the ridge base, across open ground that had been a rice paddy before the invasion. The paddy was dry now, the earth cracked and hard, offering no concealment. Mitchell would have to cross that ground while the tank was distracted by something else, which meant timing his movement to coincide with the tank's attention being focused elsewhere. He reached the base of the ridge at 13:51 hours. The Hargo was 600 yards away, still moving slowly, still traversing its turret. Mitchell studied the terrain between his position and the drainage ditch. There was a slight depression running north-south, probably a former irrigation channel, offering perhaps 18 inches of dead space if he crawled. Not much, but enough if the tank crew wasn't actively watching this sector. He waited. The tank's turret continued its traverse, sweeping past the ridge, focusing on the northern approach. When the turret was oriented 30 degrees away from Mitchell's position, he moved, low crawl, elbows and knees, rifle cradled across his forearms, moving as fast as he could while staying below the depression's rim. The ground was hard and hot, baking in the afternoon sun. Sweat soaked through his uniform within seconds. He covered 50 yards before the tank's turret began to traverse back toward his sector. He flattened completely, face pressed into the dirt, and waited. The turret swept past, continued its traverse, moved away again. Mitchell resumed crawling. Another 50 yards. The drainage ditch was closer now, maybe 100 yards ahead. He could see the vegetation along its edges, thick tropical growth that would provide concealment once he reached it. The question was whether he could cover that final 100 yards before the tank spotted him, or the turret traverse brought the main gun to bear on his position. At 13:56 hours, when the turret was oriented away from him, Mitchell stood and ran, sprinting across open ground, grenades bouncing against his hips, rifle in his hands, covering ground as fast as his legs would move. He'd covered 60 yards when he heard the tank's engine note change. The Hargo was turning. The commander had spotted movement. The turret was traversing to engage. Mitchell had maybe 10 seconds before that 37mm gun fired. He dove into the drainage ditch at a full sprint, hitting the bottom hard, rolling, coming up against the far side as the first round passed overhead. The shell impacted somewhere behind him, the explosion muffled by distance. Mitchell pressed himself against the ditch wall, breathing hard, checking his grenades. None had been damaged in the fall. He had 17 chances to disable this tank, and the crew now knew he was here. The sugarcane concealed his exact position, but the tank commander knew the general area. Mitchell could hear the Hargo's engine getting louder. The tank was advancing toward the drainage ditch. The commander was being aggressive, probably assuming Mitchell was a lone Marine scout who could be crushed before calling for support. That aggression was a mistake. If the tank advanced close enough, Mitchell would have the opportunity he needed. The ditch ran roughly parallel to the tank's line of advance, meaning Mitchell could move along it while staying concealed. He began moving north, away from where he'd entered the ditch, relocating before the tank reached his original position. The sugarcane was thick enough that he could barely see the Hargo through the stalks, just glimpses of armor and the turret traversing back and forth. The tank was perhaps 100 yards away now, moving slowly, the commander searching for his target. Mitchell moved 50 yards along the ditch, then stopped and waited. The tank's engine note changed again. It was turning, adjusting its course to follow the ditch line. The commander was smart. using the terrain to limit Mitchell's escape routes. If the tank paralleled the ditch, Mitchell would be pinned between the tank and the ridge, with no way to escape without exposing himself to the main gun. But that also meant the tank would pass within grenade range. Mitchell positioned himself at a bend in the ditch where the vegetation was thickest. From here, he could see a 30-yard section of the dirt track the tank was following. If the Hago maintained its current course, it would pass within 40 yards of his position, exposing its thinner side armor. The tank appeared at 14:02 hours, emerging from the sugarcane like a metal beast, its tracks churning the dirt, its turret still traversing. Mitchell could see the commander's head and shoulders protruding from the cupola. The commander was standing, scanning for targets, exposing himself to get better visibility. That was another mistake. Mitchell could kill that commander with a rifle shot, but doing so would alert the rest of the crew without disabling the tank. Better to wait, let the tank close to optimal range, and go for the mechanical kill. The Hago closed to 60 yards, 50 yards, 45 yards. The side armor was visible now, the engine deck with its ventilation grills, the treads with their mechanical assemblies. Mitchell could see oil stains on the armor, dust coating the treads, the number 23 inches painted in white on the turret. This wasn't an anonymous machine. It was a specific tank with specific vulnerabilities, and Mitchell had studied enough intelligence briefs to know where those vulnerabilities were. At 40 yards, Mitchell stood and threw his first grenade. The Mark II arced through the air, spinning, and landed directly on the engine deck. It detonated 2 seconds later, the explosion sending shrapnel across the rear of the tank. The commander's head snapped around, and Mitchell threw his second grenade, then his third and fourth in rapid succession, targeting the treads and the engine compartment. The explosions were deafening. Smoke and dust obscured the tank. Mitchell couldn't see if he'd achieved any damage, but he kept throwing grenades, pulling pins, lobbing them in rapid sequence. 5, 6, 7 grenades in 15 seconds. The tank's main gun fired, but the round went wide. The gunner couldn't see through the smoke and dust, was firing blind. Mitchell's 8th grenade landed directly on the left tread assembly. The explosion shredded the track, sending metal fragments spinning. The 9th grenade penetrated through an engine ventilation grill, and 3 seconds later, Mitchell heard a muffled secondary explosion from inside the tank's engine compartment. Black smoke began pouring from the rear deck. The tank wasn't dead yet. The turret was still traversing, still searching. Mitchell threw his 10th and 11th grenades, both targeting the engine compartment, hoping to achieve a catastrophic kill. Both exploded on target, and the black smoke thickened, became a roiling cloud that enveloped the entire rear of the tank. The commander was screaming orders in Japanese. The turret stopped traversing. The main gun fired again, still blind, still missing. Mitchell threw his 12th, 13th, and 14th grenades. One hit the damaged left tread, completing its destruction. Another landed near the right tread, damaging but not destroying it. The third bounced off the turret and detonated in mid-air, shrapnel ricocheting off the armor. Mitchell had 3 grenades left. The tank was immobilized. The left tread was destroyed. The right tread was damaged, and the engine was smoking but possibly still functional. He needed to ensure the kill, needed to make certain this tank wouldn't be repaired and returned to service. He climbed out of the drainage ditch and ran toward the tank's rear quarter, where the armor was thinnest. The commander saw him coming and began traversing the turret. Mitchell threw his 15th grenade directly at the turret ring, the gap between the rotating turret and the hull. The grenade bounced off the armor, rolled underneath the tank, and detonated. The explosion was muffled, but Mitchell heard metal tearing, heard something inside the tank break. The tank's machine gun opened fire, bullets kicking up dirt around Mitchell's feet. He dove behind a slight rise in the ground, threw his 16th grenade blind, heard it explode somewhere near the tank. 1 grenade left. The machine gun was still firing, but the bursts were short. The gunner couldn't see him clearly, was suppressing his general area, rather than engaging a specific target. Mitchell low-crawled to a different position, circling the tank's flank. The engine was definitely damaged now. The smoke was thick and black, and he could hear metal grinding inside the engine compartment. But the turret was still mobile, still searching, and the machine gun was still active. He needed to silence that machine gun and kill the crew's ability to fight back. He stood and ran directly at the tank's rear, closing to 20 yards. The turret began to traverse toward him, but it was moving slowly. Something inside the tank was damaged, reducing the traverse rate. Mitchell threw his final grenade directly at the engine ventilation grills. The grenade penetrated through the grillwork and disappeared inside the engine compartment. The explosion was internal and violent. The entire rear deck of the tank lifted slightly, then settled. Flames erupted from the ventilation grills. The engine sound changed from a grinding roar to a stuttering cough, then stopped entirely. Smoke and flames poured from the rear of the tank. The commander emerged from the cupola, flames following him, his uniform smoking. Mitchell raised his rifle, then lowered it. The commander was no longer a threat. He was a man on fire, stumbling away from his destroyed tank, trying to beat out the flames consuming his clothes. 2 more crew members emerged through the side hatches, both smoking, both staggering. Mitchell heard gunfire from the ridge. Rodriguez and Williams had opened up with their BARs, suppressing the crew members, preventing them from taking cover and potentially returning fire. The 3 Japanese tankers went down under the concentrated fire, and the battlefield fell silent except for the crackling flames consuming the Hargo. Mitchell stood alone between the burning tank and the drainage ditch, his web gear empty of grenades, his uniform soaked with sweat and covered in dirt. The tank was dead. Mobility kill, engine destroyed, crew casualties. It wouldn't be calling artillery on the marine positions. It wouldn't be advancing up the ridge. It was just a burning hulk now, black smoke rising into the afternoon sky like a funeral pyre. He retrieved his rifle and began walking back toward the ridge. The return trip across the rice paddy was longer than he remembered, and by the time he reached the volcanic rock, his legs were shaking from exhaustion and adrenaline crash. Rodriguez met him at the base, grabbed his shoulder to steady him. "Jesus Christ, Corporal, we thought you were dead." "Not yet. How's the situation on the ridge?" "Quiet. No movement from the tree line. I think that tank was a solo scout, not the vanguard of an assault." "Good. Get sentries posted. That smoke is going to draw attention, and we need to be ready when it does." Mitchell climbed back to the ridge position, dropped his empty web gear, and sat with his back against a volcanic boulder. His hands were shaking now that the action was over, and he couldn't make them stop. 17 grenades. Approximately 90 seconds from first throw to final explosion. 1 destroyed Type 95 Hago light tank. 3 crew casualties. 0 friendly casualties. The tactical manual said infantry didn't engage armor without support, but the tactical manual was written by people who'd never been trapped on a volcanic ridge with 38 Marines, no radio, no resupply, and a Japanese tank bearing down on their position. In that situation, the manual didn't matter. What mattered was finding a solution with the resources available, executing that solution before the situation deteriorated further, and accepting that the odds of survival were poor but the alternative was certain death. Private Williams approached with a canteen. "Corporal, you need water." Mitchell drank, the water tasting like metal and dust. "What's our ammunition situation?" "Rifle ammunition, adequate. Bar ammunition, low. No grenades except what we stripped from the dead. No mortar rounds. 1 bazooka with no rockets. So we're defensive only." "Yes, Corporal." Mitchell nodded and closed his eyes. The exhaustion was hitting hard now, the adrenaline crash making his whole body feel heavy and unresponsive. He'd killed a tank with grenades because there was no other option, because the manual said it was impossible, but impossible wasn't acceptable when 38 lives were at stake. The Japanese counterattack came at 18:30 hours, 3 hours after the tank engagement. Mitchell heard it before he saw it. The sound of infantry moving through the sugarcane, the metallic click of equipment, the low voices of men coordinating an assault. He estimated 50 to 80 enemy infantry, advancing in 2 columns using the sugarcane for concealment as they approached the ridge base. Mitchell had positioned his Marines in a defensive perimeter along the ridge crest, taking advantage of the volcanic rock for cover. The 38 Marines were divided into 8 fire teams, each with overlapping fields of fire covering the approaches. They had no grenades for the assault, no mortar support, no heavy weapons except the 2 bayars. But they had elevation, they had cover, and they had clear lines of sight once the Japanese infantry emerged from the sugarcane. The Japanese advance was methodical and professional. They weren't charging blindly. They were using fire and movement tactics, with one element providing covering fire while another element advanced. Mitchell could see their discipline in the way they moved, the way they maintained interval between soldiers, the way they used the terrain for concealment. These weren't conscripts or garrison troops. These were frontline infantry who knew how to fight. Mitchell held his fire. Let them come closer. Let them commit to the attack. The key to defensive success was timing. Open fire too early and the enemy could retreat and regroup. Open fire too late and they'd be in grenade range before the Marines could inflict sufficient casualties. The optimal engagement range was between 70 and 100 yards, close enough for accurate rifle fire, but far enough that the enemy couldn't effectively return grenades or close assault. The Japanese made their tactical error at 1835 hours when the first wave emerged from the sugarcane into the open ground at the ridge base. They'd miscalculated the approach, had assumed the Marines would engage earlier, had committed their assault element before confirming the Marine positions. Mitchell let them advance another 20 yards, let them expose themselves completely, let them reach the point where retreat would be as dangerous as continuing the assault. "Fire!" Mitchell shouted, and 38 M1 Garrons opened up simultaneously. The concentrated rifle fire was devastating. The Japanese infantry had no cover, no concealment, and no immediate cover to retreat behind. The first wave went down in seconds, maybe 20 men killed or wounded in the initial volley. The second wave tried to return fire, but they were shooting uphill at elevated positions with rock cover. Their return fire was ineffective, kicking up dust and rock fragments but not hitting Marine positions. Rodriguez and Williams opened up with the bars, their automatic fire raking across the Japanese second wave, forcing them to go to ground. The Japanese were pinned now, unable to advance or retreat effectively, taking casualties from enfilade fire as the Marine fire teams coordinated their targeting. Mitchell calculated ammunition expenditure in real time. 38 Marines, each firing maybe 10 rounds in the first minute, meant approximately 380 rounds expended. They'd started this engagement with maybe 200 rounds total after the tank battle. The math didn't work. They were burning through ammunition faster than sustainable, and if the Japanese had reinforcements or could sustain pressure, the Marines would be out of ammunition within 5 minutes. "Cease fire," Mitchell shouted. "Conserve ammunition. Fire only on visible targets." The volume of fire decreased immediately as Marines shifted to aimed fire rather than suppressive fire. This was more efficient but also gave the Japanese infantry an opportunity to maneuver. Mitchell saw a Japanese squad leader organizing his men for a flanking movement along the western slope of the ridge. If that flanking element succeeded, they'd compromise the Marine perimeter and force a close-quarters fight that would favor Japanese numbers over Marine firepower. Rodriguez, Williams, suppressed that flanking element on the western slope. Both bars shifted fire, their tracer rounds marking targeting for the rifle teams. The flanking element went to ground, taking casualties, their movement disrupted. But this was costing ammunition. Each bar burst was 15 to 20 rounds, and Rodriguez only had maybe 50 rounds left before his weapon ran dry. The Japanese assault broke at 1839 hours. 4 minutes after it began, the survivors retreated back into the sugarcane, dragging wounded when possible, leaving dead where they fell. Mitchell counted at least 30 bodies in the open ground between the sugarcane and the ridge base. The Marines had suffered one casualty. Private Hayes had taken a round through the shoulder, painful but not immediately life-threatening. Mitchell immediately called for ammunition status. Reports from each fire team. The numbers were worse than he'd feared. Total remaining rifle ammunition approximately 150 rounds. BAR ammunition approximately 25 rounds. That meant another engagement was possible but barely, and a third engagement would leave them fighting with bayonets and entrenching tools. Lieutenant Morrison appeared at Mitchell's position at 1845 hours. Corporal, good work on that engagement, but we're critically low on ammunition. I know, sir. We have maybe enough for one more defensive action, and then we're done. I've sent runners to try to make contact with friendly forces, but I'm not optimistic. We need to prepare for the possibility that we'll be overrun. Mitchell nodded. Sir, with your permission, I'd like to send a detail to strip ammunition from the Japanese casualties. They were carrying Type 38 rifles, which won't work with our weapons, but they might have grenades or other equipment we can use. Do it. Take 2 Marines, work fast, and be back before full dark. The Japanese will be watching those bodies, and they might use them as bait for an ambush. Mitchell took Rodriguez and Carson on the ammunition detail, moving down the ridge at 1855 hours while there was still enough light to work. They reached the first Japanese casualty, a young soldier, maybe 19, killed by a rifle round through the chest. Mitchell searched the body quickly and efficiently, removing 2 Type 97 hand grenades from the soldier's web gear, checking for any other useful equipment. They moved from body to body, working methodically, collecting grenades, canteens, and anything else that might be useful. Mitchell was hyper-aware of the sugarcane 50 yards away, of the possibility that Japanese riflemen were watching through rifle scopes, of the fact that this was the most exposed he'd been since crawling across the rice paddy to engage the tank. They collected 14 Type 97 grenades, 6 canteens of water, and several first aid kits before rifle fire from the sugarcane forced them to abort and return to the ridge. Mitchell had been right. The Japanese were using the casualties as bait, and they'd been seconds away from walking into an ambush. They'd gotten lucky again, but luck was a finite resource, and Mitchell knew they were running low on it. The relief column arrived at 2015 hours, just as full darkness fell. Mitchell heard American tank engines before he saw the column. Mun 4 Shermans advancing down the coastal road, infantry following in their wake, the unmistakable sound of American military power rolling forward. The cavalry had arrived 3 days late, but finally here. Lieutenant Morrison met with the relief column commander, explained the platoon's situation, and coordinated integration back into the main Marine line. Mitchell's fire team was pulled off the ridge at 2100 hours, exhausted and running on adrenaline fumes, their uniforms soaked with sweat and covered in volcanic dust. Private Williams collapsed as soon as they reached the rear area, his legs simply giving out after 3 days of constant stress. The corpsman checked him and diagnosed severe dehydration and exhaustion, but nothing that rest and fluids wouldn't fix. Rodriguez sat beside Mitchell, neither of them speaking, both too tired to process what they'd just survived. Mitchell realized he was shaking again, the adrenaline crash hitting him hard now that the immediate danger had passed. 3 days on that ridge, 1 Japanese tank destroyed with hand grenades, 1 infantry counterattack repelled with minimal ammunition, 1 fire team member down from wounds, 1 down from exhaustion, but everyone still alive. The math had worked, barely, and they'd survived when survival seemed impossible. Lieutenant Morrison approached at 21:30 hours. Corporal Mitchell, I need your after-action report. Mitchell stood, his body protesting the movement. Sir, we engaged and destroyed 1 enemy Type 95 light tank at approximately 1400 hours. Enemy infantry counterattack repelled at 1835 hours. Estimated enemy casualties 40 to 50. Friendly casualties 1 wounded, 1 exhausted. Current ammunition status. Critical 150 rounds rifle, 25 rounds BR, 14 Japanese grenades collected from enemy casualties. Morrison stared at him. You destroyed a tank with hand grenades? Yes, sir. Mark II fragmentation grenades, supplemented with Type 97 grenades collected during ammunition detail. Mobility kill followed by engine fire. Tank is still burning about 400 yards southeast of the ridge position. Corporal, the manual says infantry doesn't engage armor without support. Yes, sir, but we didn't have support, and waiting meant that tank would call artillery on our position. We had 17 grenades and 90 seconds, so we engaged. Morrison was quiet for a long moment. Processing this. Show me the tank. Mitchell led Morrison and a reinforced squad down to where the Hago was still smouldering. The flames had died completely now, but the tank was clearly destroyed, treads shredded, engine compartment a charred ruin, armor pockmarked with grenade impacts and shrapnel scoring. The 3 Japanese crew members lay nearby where they'd fallen, their bodies covered with ponchos by the Marines who'd secured the area. Morrison walked around the tank slowly, examining the damage, occasionally glancing at Mitchell with an expression that mixed disbelief and respect. He stopped at the left tread, where grenade impacts had literally torn the track assembly apart, leaving twisted metal and broken road wheels. 17 fragmentation grenades did this. Yes, sir. Concentrated on mechanical vulnerabilities, treads, engine ventilation, turret ring. The armor held, but the mechanics didn't. Once I achieved the mobility kill, the engine fire did the rest. This should not have worked, Corporal. I know, sir, but the alternative was letting that tank live and call fire on our position. Every Marine on that ridge would be dead if I'd done nothing. Morrison nodded slowly, his face grave. I'm putting you in for a Silver Star. This is the kind of initiative and courage we need from our NCOs. Sir, I was just solving a problem with the tools available. Rodriguez and Williams provided suppressing fire that allowed me to approach Private Carson, helped with the ammunition detail afterward. This wasn't a solo action. It was a fire team effort. The fire team followed your plan and executed on your orders. The leadership was yours, and so is the commendation. Do you have any objection to receiving the Silver Star? Mitchell wanted to object, wanted to explain that what he'd done was necessity rather than heroism, that accepting a medal for desperate improvisation felt wrong. But he also understood that Morrison was right. Leadership meant making decisions when no good options existed, and accepting responsibility for those decisions included accepting recognition when they succeeded. No objection, sir. Good. Get your men fed and rested. We're moving out at 0600 hours to continue the advance. The battalion relocated the platoon off the ridge the next morning, integrating them back into the main line. Mitchell's fire team was assigned to a reserve position, given resupply, and allowed 48 hours to rest and recover. The destroyed Hago remained where it had burned, a landmark that other Marines used for navigation. Turn left at the burned-out Jap tank, advance 200 yards. That's where 2nd Platoon is holding. The tank became a minor tourist attraction for Marines rotating through the area. Officers would bring their platoons to examine the wreck, using it as a teaching example of what infantry could accomplish against armor under desperate circumstances. Mitchell heard stories about his engagement that bore only passing resemblance to what had actually happened. Tales of him single-handedly charging the tank with a bayonet, of him climbing onto the hull to drop grenades through the commander's cupola, of him surviving multiple direct hits from the 37mm gun. He tried to correct these stories when he heard them, but myths have their own momentum, and the truth was less interesting than the legend. Mitchell received the Silver Star 3 weeks later, during a ceremony at the battalion command post. The citation read, "For conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity in action against the enemy, Corporal Mitchell, with complete disregard for his own safety, single-handedly engaged and destroyed an enemy light tank using only hand grenades, preventing enemy armor from overrunning his position, and saving the lives of 38 Marines under his protection. His actions exemplify the highest traditions of the Marine Corps and reflect great credit upon himself and the United States Naval Service. He accepted the medal, saluted, and returned to his fire team. Rodriguez congratulated him, but Mitchell deflected the praise just as he'd deflected Morrison's commendation. The Silver Star was recognition of an action, but that action had been necessity rather than choice. When you were trapped on a ridge with no support and a tank bearing down on your position, you didn't have the luxury of heroic gestures. You had grenades and terrain and 90 seconds, and you used what you had because the alternative was death for everyone depending on you. The Battle of Saipan continued for another month. Mitchell's platoon participated in the final assault on Mount Tapachar, the highest point on the island and the last major Japanese defensive position. The fighting was brutal, cave to cave, position to position, with Japanese defenders who refused to surrender and fought until killed. Mitchell's fire team cleared 17 cave positions during that assault, suffering 2 wounded but no killed, and by the time Mount Tapachar was declared secure in early July, Mitchell had been promoted to sergeant and was leading a full squad instead of just a fire team. Of the 38 Marines who'd been trapped on that volcanic ridge in mid-June, 34 survived the battle. Private Williams was killed during the Mount Tapachar assault when a Japanese grenade landed in his position. He'd thrown himself on it to save 3 other Marines, receiving the Medal of Honor posthumously. Private Hayes, who'd been wounded during the infantry counterattack, survived and was evacuated to Hawaii for medical treatment. The other 2 casualties came during separate engagements, neither related to armor or the volcanic ridge. After Saipan, Mitchell's battalion shipped to Hawaii for rest and reconstitution, a 2-month period where replacements were integrated and veterans were given time to recover from the physical and psychological toll of sustained combat. The training cadre identified Mitchell as someone with valuable tactical knowledge and asked him to give lectures on armor engagement tactics, using his Hago kill as a case study in improvised anti-armor operations. Mitchell stood in front of 200 Marines in a lecture hall at Camp Tarawa and told them the unvarnished truth about what he'd done on Saipan. No heroic embellishments, no tactical genius, just the reality of a desperate situation that required desperate actions. He explained the terrain, the lack of support, the calculation that staying on the ridge with a tank approaching was death, and the slight possibility that concentrated grenade fire might achieve a mobility kill. The manual says infantry doesn't engage armor without proper anti-tank weapons, Mitchell told them. The manual is correct 99% of the time, but there's that 1%, that moment when the manual doesn't apply, when you're cut off and alone, and the tank is coming and you have to make a choice. In that moment, you use what you have. You calculate the odds as best you can. You accept that you'll probably die trying. And then you act anyway, because not acting means everyone under your command dies. One of the trainees raised his hand. "Sergeant, how did you know the grenades would work against the tank?" "I didn't know. I knew the Hago was a light tank with thin side armor compared to its frontal protection. I knew its treads were mechanical assemblies vulnerable to explosive damage. I knew the engine compartment had ventilation grills that might allow grenade penetration, but I didn't know whether 17 grenades would be enough, or whether I could get close enough to throw them accurately, or whether the tank crew would kill me before I could complete the engagement. What if it hadn't worked? Then I'd be dead. Rodriguez and Williams would probably be dead, and the rest of the platoon would have been killed when that tank called artillery on our position. But doing nothing was also certain death, so the choice was between definite failure and possible success. I chose possible success, fully aware that possible success still meant probable death. Another trainee: "Would you do it again, if you were in the same situation?" Mitchell thought carefully before answering. "If I was in the same exact situation, cut off, no support, tank advancing, no other viable options, yes, I'd do it again, but I'd spend every second hoping I'd never be in that situation again, because what I did was desperate and dangerous, and only worked because multiple variables aligned in my favor. The Hago commander made tactical errors. The terrain provided a concealed approach route. 17 grenades was barely sufficient. Change any one of those variables, and I'm dead. The tank's commander stays buttoned up. I can't suppress him with rifle fire. The drainage ditch doesn't provide concealment. I'm shot, crossing open ground. 16 grenades instead of 17? Maybe the tank survives with enough mobility to retreat. Luck matters as much as skill in combat, and anyone who tells you otherwise is lying. The lecture became part of the battalion's standard training curriculum, but Mitchell noticed that the training cadre emphasized his cautions more than his tactics. The official lesson wasn't "here's how to kill tanks with grenades." The lesson was doctrine exists for good reasons. Deviation is only justified when all alternatives are worse, and survival often depends on circumstances beyond your control. Mitchell gave that lecture 17 times over the 2 months in Hawaii, each time refining his message, each time trying to communicate that what he'd done on Saipan wasn't a template for standard operations, but rather an example of how Marines adapt when standard operations become impossible. He wanted the new Marines to understand that the Corps valued initiative and improvisation, but also that improvisation carried real costs and real risks, and that sometimes the improvised solution still resulted in failure and death. The lectures evolved as Mitchell refined his understanding of what had happened on that volcanic ridge. Initially, he focused on the technical aspects: grenade placement, approach routes, timing the throws between ship rolls, but he gradually realized that the technical details were less important than the decision-making process that had led to the engagement. The real lesson wasn't how to kill a tank with grenades. The real lesson was how to make life-or-death decisions under pressure, when all available options appeared suicidal. He started incorporating decision tree analysis into his lectures. When I saw that Hago emerge from the sugarcane, I had maybe 60 seconds to evaluate options before the tank's commander spotted our positions. Option 1. Engage with available weapons. Probability of success: maybe 20%. Probability of death: 80%. Option 2. Attempt evasion and withdrawal from the ridge. Probability of success: maybe 10%. We'd be exposed during movement, and the tank could call artillery. Probability of death: 90%. Option 3. Hold position and hope the tank doesn't spot us. Probability of success near zero. Our positions were obvious from the valley floor. Probability of death near 100%. When you run that analysis, engaging the tank becomes the rational choice despite the terrible odds, because it's the only option that isn't certain death. One lecture attendee, a lieutenant who'd just arrived from Quantico, raised an objection. "Sergeant, your analysis assumes you correctly estimated those probabilities. What if you were wrong? What if engaging the tank was actually lower probability than the other options?" Then I made a mistake, and I'd be dead. But I made the best calculation I could with the information available. Perfect information doesn't exist in combat. You estimate probabilities based on terrain, enemy capabilities, your own capabilities, and time available. Then you choose the option with the highest survival probability and execute it before circumstances change. But how do you learn to make those calculations under pressure? Mitchell thought carefully. You train until the analysis becomes automatic. You study armor capabilities, memorize their weaknesses, understand their tactical doctrines. You practice terrain analysis until you can identify concealed approach routes instantly. You train with your weapons until you know their effective ranges and capabilities without conscious thought. All of that study and training compresses the decision-making timeline from minutes to seconds. When the tank appeared, I didn't need to consciously remember that the Hago had thin side armor. I knew it automatically. I didn't need to calculate grenade effective range. My training had already established those parameters. The only conscious decision was choosing to engage rather than evade, and that decision took maybe 5 seconds because all the preparatory analysis was already complete. This concept that split-second tactical decisions required years of preparation became central to Mitchell's lectures. He would spend 45 minutes explaining his background, the intelligence briefs he'd studied about Japanese armor, the grenade practice he'd conducted during training, the terrain analysis skills he'd developed through repeated combat operations. All of that preparation had compressed into 90 seconds of execution on the Saipan volcanic ridge. One Marine approached Mitchell after a lecture, a young corporal named Peterson who'd just arrived from the States and had heard exaggerated stories about the tank engagement. "Sergeant, I heard stories about you taking out that tank, but the stories all said you charged it head-on and destroyed it in hand-to-hand combat." Mitchell shook his head, frustrated, but not surprised. "The stories are wrong. I crawled through a drainage ditch for 200 yards, approached from the flank while the crew was distracted by suppressing fire from my fire team, and threw grenades at mechanical components until the tank couldn't move and then couldn't fight. There was no hand-to-hand combat, no bayonet charge, no heroic last stand, just calculation, execution, and enough luck to survive." "But you still killed it." "One Marine, one tank, 17 grenades. One Marine throwing the grenades, 2 Marines providing suppressing fire that forced the tank commander to button up and lose visibility, favorable terrain that provided a concealed approach route, and an enemy commander who made multiple tactical errors. Remove any one of those factors and I'm dead." This isn't a story about individual heroism. It's a story about how Marines use every available resource and advantage when faced with impossible situations. The moment you start thinking of it as individual heroism is the moment you start making stupid decisions that get people killed. Peterson nodded, clearly disappointed. Mitchell could see the kid had wanted to hear about glory and individual courage, about a Marine who'd single-handedly destroyed an enemy tank through sheer determination. Instead, he'd gotten a lecture about calculated risk, the importance of supporting fire, and the decisive role of luck in combat survival. But Mitchell wasn't going to lie to make the story more palatable or recruitment-friendly. Marines died when they believed myths about combat being glorious or individual courage being sufficient. Mitchell would rather disappoint recruits with truth than contribute to getting them killed with comfortable myths. The training cadre eventually asked Mitchell to write a formal tactical analysis of the engagement for inclusion in Marine Corps training materials. He spent 2 weeks on the document, producing a 30-page analysis that covered terrain, enemy capabilities, weapons employment, decision-making under pressure, and post-action assessment. The analysis was brutally honest about the low probability of success and the role of luck in the outcome. The final paragraph read, "The engagement described in this document succeeded due to a combination of training, calculation, execution, and favorable circumstances. Any Marine attempting similar tactics should understand that probability of success in armor engagements using fragmentation grenades is low, probability of survival is low, and this approach should only be attempted when all alternative courses of action offer even lower survival probability. The primary lesson is not tactical, it is philosophical. Marines succeed in impossible situations by refusing to accept impossibility as determinative, by calculating probabilities honestly, and by executing the highest probability course of action regardless of personal risk. This decision-making framework applies to all combat situations, not merely armor engagement." The document became required reading for NCO candidates at Camp Lejeune and influenced Marine Corps tactical doctrine for decades. But Mitchell never saw it as his proudest achievement. He'd written it because the training cadre asked him to, and because he wanted to ensure that if Marines were going to learn from his experience, they'd learn the truth rather than the myth. Mitchell survived the war, participating in the Battle of Tinian in July-August 1944, and then spending the final year of the war training for the planned invasion of Japan that never happened. When the atomic bombs ended the war in August 1945, Mitchell was a staff sergeant with 2 Silver Stars, 1 Bronze Star with V device, and a reputation throughout the division as the Marine who'd killed a tank with grenades on Saipan. He never felt comfortable with that reputation. The Silver Stars represented moments when desperation and calculation aligned with favorable circumstances, not demonstrations of tactical genius or exceptional courage. He'd been a corporal, and then a sergeant doing his job under terrible conditions, making the best decisions he could with incomplete information and inadequate resources, and surviving when many better Marines hadn't. The medals represented luck as much as skill, and Mitchell knew that luck was never guaranteed to hold. After the war, Mitchell returned to Iowa, worked as a farm equipment mechanic, married his high school sweetheart, and raised 3 children. He almost never spoke about the war, and when his children asked about the medals in the drawer, he'd tell them he'd been lucky to survive, that many better men hadn't, and that the medals represented moments when luck and desperation aligned rather than genuine heroism. His oldest son Thomas pressed him once when he was 16 in 1968, during the height of the Vietnam War, when the nation was debating military service and the morality of combat. "Dad, you must have done something special to earn 2 silver stars. What were they for?" Mitchell considered how to answer honestly without glorifying combat or making war seem like an adventure. He sat his son down at the kitchen table, poured them both coffee, and told the truth in a way he'd never told anyone outside the Marine Corps. "I solved problems using whatever tools were available. On Saipan in June 1944, that meant using hand grenades against a Japanese tank, because we had no proper anti-tank weapons, no radio communication with battalion, and no prospect of support arriving before that tank identified our position and called artillery that would have killed everyone on that ridge. The grenades worked, the tank died, and 38 Marines survived who would have died otherwise. But it was desperation, not heroism. When you're trapped with no good options, you try the least bad option and hope it works. That's all it was. But you still did it. You didn't run away or give up or freeze. Running away wasn't an option. There was nowhere to run to. Giving up meant watching my Marines die, and I wasn't willing to accept that. Freezing would have had the same result. So I used the only tools available, 17 fragmentation grenades and a drainage ditch that provided concealment, and I got lucky enough that the tools worked and the tank died before it could kill us. That's all combat is, son. Making the best decisions you can with what you have, and hoping luck stays on your side long enough to survive." Thomas was quiet for a moment, processing this. Then he asked the question that Mitchell had known was coming. "Do you think what we're doing in Vietnam is like what you did on Saipan? Are we solving problems with the tools available?" Mitchell chose his words carefully. "I don't know enough about the strategic situation in Vietnam to answer that. What I can tell you is this. Wars should only be fought when the alternatives are worse than fighting, when the objectives are clear and achievable, and when the people fighting believe the cause is worth the cost. I believed those things in 1944. Whether they're true in 1968 is something you'll have to decide for yourself. But don't go to war because of myths about heroism or glory. Go to war, if you go, because you've calculated that fighting is necessary, and you're willing to accept the consequences of that calculation." Thomas didn't get drafted. His lottery number was high enough that he never served. But that conversation at the kitchen table in 1968 became formative for him, shaped his understanding of military service and moral decision-making, and decades later, he would tell his own children about the grandfather who'd killed a tank with grenades, but refused to glorify the action, or present it as anything more than desperate problem-solving under terrible conditions. He did tell them one thing that his own father had told him before the war: when facing impossible odds, and the rulebook says what you're considering is suicide, you calculate the alternatives honestly. If all alternatives are worse than the suicidal option, then the suicidal option becomes the rational choice. That's not heroism or courage. That's just mathematics applied to life and death situations. Sometimes the math says you attack the tank with grenades because letting the tank live is certain death, and attacking it is only probable death. That calculation doesn't make you a hero. It just makes you someone who can do math under pressure. James Mitchell died in 1989 at the age of 68, having never returned to Saipan, having never sought additional recognition beyond the medals he'd earned during the war. His obituary in the Cedar Rapids Gazette mentioned his Marine service and his silver stars, but focused primarily on his 44 years as a farm equipment mechanic. and his involvement in the local VFW post, where he'd served as quartermaster for 12 years and helped countless younger veterans navigate VA benefit systems and adjust to civilian life after their own combat experiences. The medals were buried with him, pinned to his dress uniform in the closed casket, symbols of moments when calculation and desperation aligned with enough luck to produce survival rather than death. His funeral was attended by over 200 people, including 17 Marines who'd served with him on Saipan or Tinian and had made the journey to Iowa to honor their former sergeant. Rodriguez flew in from New Mexico, elderly now but still recognizable, still carrying himself with the unmistakable bearing of a Marine even at 70 years old. He spoke at the funeral, telling stories about Mitchell's leadership on Saipan, his refusal to accept impossible situations as determinative, his insistence on bringing every Marine home if humanly possible, his calculation under pressure that had saved 38 lives on a volcanic ridge in June 1944. "Jim Mitchell was the best NCO I ever served under," Rodriguez said, his voice breaking slightly with emotion and age. "He taught us that Marines adapt and overcome, that doctrine is a guide rather than a prison, and that sometimes the only way to save lives is to risk your own in ways that no training manual would ever recommend." He killed a tank with 17 grenades because letting that tank live meant watching his Marines die, and he wasn't willing to accept that outcome. That's who Jim Mitchell was, a Marine who calculated odds honestly, chose the highest probability course of action regardless of personal cost, and executed with precision even when the odds were terrible. We're all here today because Jim made that choice on a volcanic ridge in June 1944, and every day we've lived since then is a gift he gave us through his courage and his calculation and his refusal to accept our deaths as inevitable. The destroyed Type 95 Hago remained on Saipan for years after the war, gradually rusting into the landscape, becoming overgrown with tropical vegetation, serving as a landmark for the few people who still remembered the battles fought on the island. It was finally removed during a construction project in 1963, cut up for scrap, its metal recycled without ceremony or recognition. By then, the tank was barely recognizable, just corroded metal and broken mechanical assemblies with nothing to indicate how it had been destroyed or who had destroyed it. What remains is the story taught at Marine Corps tactical schools from Quantico to Camp Pendleton, cited in armor engagement doctrine manuals, referenced in after-action reports from Korea, Vietnam, and subsequent conflicts. The story of a corporal who killed a tank with 17 fragmentation grenades because letting the tank live meant certain death for 38 Marines. The story of 90 seconds that defied tactical doctrine and training, but succeeded through calculation, execution, and favorable circumstances. The lesson the Marine Corps derived from Mitchell's engagement wasn't tactical. It wasn't about specific techniques for engaging armor with grenades. The lesson was philosophical. Marines succeed when they refuse to accept impossible situations as determinative. When doctrine offers no solutions, when resources are inadequate, when the odds favor the enemy, Marines create solutions from what they have rather than surrender to what they lack. That principle, more than Mitchell's specific actions on Saipan, became his enduring contribution to Marine Corps culture. But Mitchell himself never saw it that way. In his final years, when veterans organizations invited him to speak about his combat experience, he declined politely. He had nothing inspirational to say about war, nothing that would make good recruitment material, nothing that would satisfy people looking for heroic narratives. War had been terrible, survival had been luck, and the medals represented moments of desperation rather than glory. Better to let people remember the myths if they needed myths. The truth was darker and less satisfying, and Mitchell saw no reason to burden others with it. 17 grenades thrown in 90 seconds of calculated violence. One destroyed Type 95 Hago light tank with shredded treads and burned-out engine. 38 United States Marines who lived to fight another day because a corporal made a calculation under impossible pressure and got lucky enough that the calculation proved correct. Because desperation met preparation, met favorable terrain, met enemy mistakes. Because one Marine refused to accept certain death as the only outcome when a slight chance of survival existed through action rather than acceptance. That was the story. Not heroic, not glorious, just a Marine doing his job with inadequate resources and surviving when survival seemed impossible. It's the story of every Marine who ever faced impossible odds and chose action over acceptance, calculation over surrender, possible success over certain failure. The lesson the Marine Corps took from Mitchell's engagement wasn't that infantry should engage armor with grenades. The lesson was that when all doctrinal solutions fail, Marines create solutions from available resources, execute those solutions under pressure, and accept catastrophic risk when the alternative is certain death. That principle, more than Mitchell's specific tactics, became his legacy, the understanding that doctrine is a guide, not a prison, and that survival sometimes requires actions that no manual would recommend. But the full story of that engagement on the volcanic ridge contains details that never made it into the tactical manuals or the Silver Star citation. The story of how Mitchell's fire team ended up isolated on that ridge in the first place, how they survived 3 days without resupply, how Mitchell learned to read Japanese armor tactics from observation and intelligence briefs, and how 38 Marines held together under conditions that should have broken them. The platoon had been cut off on June 17, 1944, during the 3rd day of the Saipan invasion. They'd been advancing south along the coastal road when Japanese forces launched a coordinated counterattack, severing the Marine line and isolating Mitchell's platoon on the volcanic ridge. Lieutenant Morrison had attempted to fight back to friendly lines, but concentrated Japanese fire made that impossible. The decision was made to hold the ridge and wait for the main Marine advance to reach them. The first night was the worst. Japanese infiltrators probed the perimeter constantly, testing for weaknesses, trying to identify the platoon's strength and dispositions. Mitchell's fire team held the southern sector, the most exposed position, where the volcanic rock offered the best fields of fire, but also the most likely avenue of Japanese approach. They spent that first night in a state of constant alertness, listening for movement, watching for shadows, occasionally firing at sounds that might have been enemy soldiers or might have been the wind moving through the sugarcane. Private Williams, the youngest Marine in the fire team, broke down around 0300 hours. The stress and fear had accumulated beyond his ability to process, and he started sobbing quietly, his whole body shaking. Mitchell pulled him aside away from the other Marines and spoke to him in a low voice that mixed authority with compassion. "Williams, I need you focused. Your fire team needs you focused. When the sun comes up, we're going to be in a fight, and I need every rifle we have. Corporal, we're going to die here. We're cut off, we're alone, and nobody's coming for us. Maybe, but we're not dead yet. And until we are, we keep fighting. You understand me?" Williams nodded, wiped his face, and returned to his position. Mitchell made a mental note to keep Williams paired with Rodriguez, whose steady temperament would help stabilize the younger Marine. That was one of the skills they didn't teach in training: how to manage the psychological stress of combat, how to keep men functioning when fear threatened to overwhelm discipline, how to recognize when a Marine was approaching his breaking point and needed intervention before he collapsed completely. The psychological toll wasn't limited to Williams. Every Marine on that ridge was dealing with the same fundamental fear that they'd been written off, that division had decided their position wasn't worth the cost of relief, that they were going to die alone on this volcanic rock while the main Marine advance continued without them. Mitchell felt that fear himself, felt it as a constant pressure in his chest, a weight that made breathing difficult. But he was a corporal, which meant he couldn't show that fear, couldn't let it affect his decision-making, couldn't let the Marines under his command see him hesitate or doubt. The second day brought the reality of their situation into sharp focus. The platoon had no resupply, which meant they were operating on whatever ammunition and supplies they'd been carrying when the line was severed. Mitchell inventoried his fire team's resources: 300 rounds of rifle ammunition, 600 rounds for the 2 BARs, 17 fragmentation grenades, 4 canteens of water, and a handful of K rations. Enough for maybe 2 significant engagements if they were careful, 1 engagement if they had to fight sustained combat. Water was becoming a critical issue. The temperature on Saipan in June regularly exceeded 90 degrees, and the Marines were working in full combat gear without shade. 4 canteens for 8 men meant half a canteen per man per day if they could make their water last 48 hours. That wasn't enough. Dehydration would start affecting combat effectiveness within 24 hours, and by the 3rd day they'd be barely functional. Mitchell sent Rodriguez and Private Carson on a water reconnaissance patrol at 1400 hours on the 2nd day. Their mission was to locate any fresh water sources within the platoon's defensive perimeter, assess those sources for portability, and report back within 2 hours. The patrol returned at 1530 hours with disappointing news. There was a small stream at the base of the ridge's eastern slope, but it was exposed to Japanese observation and fire. Any water collection detail would be conducted under direct enemy observation, which meant casualties were likely. Lieutenant Morrison made the decision to send water details during darkness, accepting the increased difficulty of operating at night in exchange for reduced enemy fire. Mitchell's fire team drew the first water detail, scheduled for 2200 hours that night. The detail would consist of 4 Marines, Mitchell, Rodriguez, Williams, and Private Hayes, carrying every available canteen and water container down the ridge's eastern slope to the stream, filling the containers and returning before dawn. The water detail departed at 2200 hours exactly, moving slowly down the volcanic slope in complete darkness. No lights, no talking, just 4 Marines feeling their way down a rocky hillside while trying not to make noise that would alert Japanese sentries. Mitchell led, counting his steps, memorizing the terrain, building a mental map he could use for the return trip. They reached the stream at 22:45 hours. The water was cold and clear, flowing over volcanic rock, probably fed by springs higher in the island's interior. Mitchell tested the water. It tasted clean. No obvious signs of contamination. They began filling canteens, working quickly and quietly, hyper-aware that Japanese forces might be watching from the sugarcane fields only 200 yards away. They'd filled half the canteens when Mitchell heard movement in the sugarcane. Japanese voices, low and urgent, maybe 50 yards away. Mitchell froze, raised his fist to signal the others to stop. They all went motionless, listening. The Japanese voices continued. A patrol, maybe 4 or 5 soldiers, moving parallel to the stream. If the patrol continued on its current heading, it would pass within 30 yards of the Marines' position. Mitchell had seconds to make a decision. Open fire and alert every Japanese soldier within earshot to their position, or stay silent and hope the patrol passed without spotting them. He chose silence. 4 Marines with half-filled canteens, pressed flat against the volcanic rock beside the stream, barely breathing, waiting for the Japanese patrol to pass. The patrol came within 25 yards. Mitchell could see their silhouettes against the slightly lighter sky, could hear their equipment rattling, could smell cigarette smoke. One of the Japanese soldiers stopped, said something to his companions, laughed. Another soldier responded. They were relaxed, not expecting contact, treating this as a routine patrol through secured territory. The patrol moved past. Mitchell waited 5 full minutes after the voices faded before resuming the water collection. They filled the remaining canteens in record time, then began the climb back up the ridge. Mitchell's heart was pounding, his hands shaking slightly from the adrenaline. They'd come within 25 yards of a firefight that would have compromised the entire platoon's position, and the only reason they'd survived was luck and silence. The detail returned to the platoon position at 0015 hours with 48 filled canteens, enough water for another 2 days if they rationed carefully. Lieutenant Morrison commended Mitchell for the successful mission, but Mitchell knew the truth. They'd gotten lucky. The Japanese patrol could have spotted them, could have opened fire, could have called artillery on the ridge. The water detail had succeeded not through skill or planning, but through chance and favorable circumstances. Lieutenant Morrison called a conference of the squad leaders and fire team leaders at 1000 hours on the third day. The meeting was brief and grim. The platoon had lost radio contact with battalion, had no way to call for fire support or medical evacuation, and was surrounded by Japanese forces who were actively hunting for isolated Marine units to destroy. The options were limited: attempt a breakout toward friendly lines, hold the current position and hope for relief, or surrender. Surrender wasn't discussed seriously. Marines didn't surrender, and everyone present knew what happened to Marines who fell into Japanese hands. The breakout option was tempting, but probably suicidal. The Japanese controlled the terrain between the ridge and friendly lines, and any movement would be detected and engaged. That left holding the position and hoping the main Marine advance would reach them before they ran out of ammunition or water. "We hold," Morrison said. "We conserve ammunition, we maintain defensive posture, and we wait for relief." Questions? Mitchell raised his hand. "Sir, what's our contingency if Japanese armor approaches our position?" "We have one bazooka with no rockets. If armor approaches, we fall back to secondary positions and hope it doesn't follow." "Sir, falling back means abandoning the high ground. If we lose this ridge, we lose the only defensive advantage we have." Morrison nodded. "I'm aware, Corporal, but we can't fight armor with rifles and grenades. If a tank shows up, we evade and survive. That's the best we can do." Mitchell didn't argue, but he also didn't agree. Evading armor meant exposing the platoon to infantry fire during movement, meant losing the defensive positions they'd spent 2 days preparing, meant accepting that a single tank could force them off the ridge and into terrain where they'd be slaughtered. There had to be another option, some way to counter armor without bazookas or anti-tank mines or air support. He spent the rest of that morning studying the terrain and thinking about armor vulnerabilities. The Hago light tank weighed 11 tons and had thin side armor compared to its frontal protection. Its engine was gasoline-powered, which meant it was vulnerable to fire if the fuel tanks were ruptured. Its treads were mechanical assemblies that could be damaged by concentrated explosions. Its crew vision ports were small, limiting observation. All of these were theoretical vulnerabilities, but exploiting them would require getting close enough to target specific components, which meant approaching within grenade range. Mitchell pulled Rodriguez aside at 11:30 hours. "If a Japanese tank approaches our position, I'm going to engage it." Rodriguez stared at him. "Corporal," Lieutenant Morrison said, "I heard what the lieutenant said, but if we fall back from this ridge, we're dead anyway. At least if I engage the tank, there's a chance I can disable it." "With what?" "We don't have anti-tank weapons. We have 17 fragmentation grenades. If I can get close enough to target the treads and engine, I might achieve a mobility kill." "That's suicide, Corporal. It's a calculated risk. The suicide option is letting the tank live and watching it massacre our platoon. This way at least one of us has a chance." Rodriguez looked like he wanted to argue, but he also understood Mitchell's logic. The platoon was trapped with limited options, and sometimes limited options meant accepting risks that would be insane under normal circumstances. "What do you need from me?" "If I engage, you and Williams provide suppressing fire on the tank's vision ports and cupola, force the crew to button up and blind themselves. That gives me a better chance to approach without being seen." "Understood, Corporal." The Hago appeared at 13:47 hours, exactly as Mitchell had feared, 800 yards away, moving slowly, searching for targets. Mitchell watched it through his field glasses, studying its movement pattern, looking for mistakes or vulnerabilities. The tank commander was standing in the cupola, exposing himself for better visibility. That was mistake number 1. An exposed commander was vulnerable to rifle fire, though killing him wouldn't disable the tank. The tank was also showing its side armor as it traversed, which was mistake number 2. A competent tank commander would keep his frontal armor toward potential threats. but this commander was treating the area as secure. 17 grenades. 90 seconds. 1 destroyed Type 95 Hago light tank. 38 Marines who lived to fight another day. The math was simple, the execution terrifying, the outcome improbable. But Corporal James Mitchell had made his calculation on that volcanic ridge, had chosen possible success over certain failure, and in doing so had demonstrated what Marines do when the manual offers no answers. They improvise, adapt and overcome, using whatever they have because surrender is not an option, and death is only acceptable if every alternative has been exhausted.